Okay. Good morning, everybody. Greetings from the rainy Montreal. So today we are going to have our second lecture by Ms. Sarah Bidgood. So today she's going to talk about Introduction to the Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament Regimes. So I'm going to give the microphone to Sarah right now. So now stage is yours, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Masako. Good morning again, everybody. So as Masako said, today we're going to be talking about the nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament regimes. So my remarks are going to kind of follow on to some of the themes that we talked about in yesterday's lecture. But if you, again, have questions, I would be delighted to answer those, either about the things that we talked about yesterday or what we're going to delve into today. So what I'd kind of like to go over here are several different treaties and negotiating bodies that comprise the nonproliferation and disarmament regimes. And in particular, what we're going to dwell upon are the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, which is something we talked about quite a bit yesterday. We're going to talk about the International Atomic Energy Agency and its relationship with the NPT. I'd like to talk a bit as well about the new treaty that we mentioned yesterday, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. We're going to talk about nuclear weapon-free zones. We're going to talk about the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and its affiliated organization, the Conference on Disarmament, and then a little bit about export control regimes. But because the focus here is really on kind of nuclear issues, I'm going to dwell in particular upon those treaties that deal with nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. But I'd be happy to go into the others in greater detail if you'd like me to. Just a word before we kind of get started about what I mean by the nonproliferation and disarmament regimes. A regime in this sense is made up of documents, so things like treaties. It's made up of negotiating bodies like the Conference on Disarmament, and it's made up of so-called places with hallways and bathrooms. So the United Nations, for example, is part of the nonproliferation regime, and it is both something that is sort of comprises different treaties and negotiating bodies, but is itself a physical space. So that's all part and parcel of these regimes that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to begin with the Nonproliferation Treaty. I picked this one to start out with because it's often referred to as the cornerstone of the nonproliferation regime. As I mentioned yesterday, negotiations concluded on the treaty in 1968, and then it entered into force rather in 1970, so just 2 years later. 190 states parties now comprise the membership of the NPT. And while it doesn't really have an organizing body that is kind of responsible for overseeing the implementation of the treaty, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs has filled that role and is often referred to as the Secretariat when the treaty is reviewed. So this is a particularly important treaty because it really governs who can have nuclear weapons and who cannot have nuclear weapons. And it sort of strikes a grand bargain between the states that do possess them, the 5 nuclear weapon states we identified yesterday, and all of the rest of the states parties who have undertaken an obligation not to acquire nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapon states are obligated to commit to undertaking negotiations in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. And then the other states, as I mentioned, commit not to acquire nuclear weapons, but in exchange, they are entitled to the many peaceful applications of nuclear energy. One thing that I think is particularly interesting to kind of note about the NPT is that its preamble, so the language that precedes the actual articles of the treaty, really reflects the time in which it was written. So it declares the intention of all states parties, not just the P5, to achieve the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date. And so we know that this was written in a period where the arms race was front and center in people's minds. And I think that's particularly something of note today when we see the potential for a resurgence of the nuclear arms race as the sort of arms control machinery begins to unravel a bit. So I think that that's a particularly kind of interesting historical parallel that we can see between when the NPT was drafted and what is going on right now. So I did mention this yesterday, but just as a refresher, the nuclear weapons states under the NPT are those who tested before January 1st of 1967. And if more states are going to join the NPT, they must join it as non-nuclear weapon states, even if they are currently nuclear weapon possessing states. So that's countries like India and Pakistan, Israel, and the DPRK. So there are 10 substantive articles of the NPT that kind of lay out the obligations. And then there's an 11th that talks about the way that the treaty is reviewed and some of the mechanics of the treaty itself. Articles 1 and 2 and Article 6 are, I would say, the ones that we talk about the most frequently. Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT lay out the obligations of states parties not to acquire nuclear weapons and conversely not to transfer nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states. Article 6 is the one that obligates all states parties, not just the nuclear weapon states, that's important, to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. And there's an important comma here, and on a treaty on the general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So different states parties interpret this in different ways, but there is an obligation to think about a treaty on general and complete disarmament that is part of Article 6. So that's kind of an interesting historical footnote there, and something that again reflects the context in which this treaty was written and the purpose that it's eventually supposed to fulfill. Article 4 is another really important article under the NPT. It affirms the inalienable right of all states parties to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And so when you look at all of these kind of in totem, they strike a grand bargain, as I said, between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The nuclear weapon states have to undertake measures to disarm, and the non-nuclear weapon states commit to not to acquire nuclear weapons, but in exchange they get access to peaceful nuclear energy. The NPT is often kind of described as resting on 3 pillars: non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful uses. And the reason that we use this imagery to talk about the NPT is because it kind of captures the idea that if one of the pillars is weaker than the others or less emphasized, that the treaty itself will not be sustainable and will not be stable. So we often hear states parties at the NPT and analysts and policymakers talk about the mutually reinforcing nature of these 3 pillars. So that kind of reflects the need to put an equal emphasis and devote equal resources across all of these 3 pillars. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I put this slide directly after the NPT because there is a very important relationship between the IAEA and the Nonproliferation Treaty. The IAEA is based in Vienna, and it's headed by Yukiya Amano, who is its Director General at the moment. The 3 kind of pillars of the IAEA, just like the pillars of the NPT, are safety and security, technical cooperation, and safeguards and verification. So those are the 3 kind of areas where the IAEA, how it divides up its responsibilities. The IAEA is really integral to the NPT because it serves as essentially its verification mechanism for the non-proliferation articles of that particular treaty. So what this means is that the IAEA is responsible essentially for making sure that material and equipment that are supposed to be for the peaceful and civilian uses of nuclear energy aren't somehow diverted to a military program. It does this in a number of ways. There are numerous types of what we call safeguards. Most of them are comprehensive safeguards agreements. So the NPT states parties conclude these with the IAEA, and in fact, it's concluded 174 of these with NPT member states. And these enable the IAEA to make sure that safeguards are applied on all nuclear material in the territory, jurisdiction, or control of a state for the purpose of verifying that such material isn't diverted to nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. The 5 nuclear weapon states codified under the NPT are not obligated to conclude safeguards agreements because they are allowed to have a military nuclear program. So the kind of obligation to fulfill a safeguards agreement is a bit different, but they have all elected to conclude voluntary safeguards agreements with the IAEA. And this basically makes sure that material that has been designated for peaceful uses isn't diverted over to the military program. There are also item-specific safeguards for states that have not joined the NPT. So, for example, India, Pakistan, and Israel have concluded these types of agreements with the IAEA. There's also something called the additional protocol. There are a number of these. They function in addition to a safeguards agreement with the IAEA to provide additional tools for the agency to conduct its verification. There are additional protocols in 133 states at the moment. I checked this morning. And part of what the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal, did while it was, when it was concluded, was it stipulated that Iran would implement an additional protocol agreement in perpetuity. So that really gave the IAEA additional measures to verify that nothing that Iran was doing in the civilian nuclear sector would somehow be diverted into a military program. So that's one of the kind of important things to know when we think about the consequences of the fact that the US has withdrawn from the JCPOA is, will we lose the additional protocol that Iran concluded with the IAEA? And if so, I think that would be a particularly negative implication of US behavior in this respect. Okay, so how do we figure out whether we have been successful in implementing the NPT, and how do we decide what we're going to do next in order to implement it better? So the Nonproliferation Treaty is reviewed in 5-year increments. For the first kind of 3 years of an NPT review cycle, you have what are called preparatory committee meetings. The first 2 of those meetings just end in a chair's summary. So the chairman or woman of the meeting is simply responsible for creating a report about what states parties discussed, what they said, and then representing that accurately to the states parties and to the international community. In the 3rd preparatory committee of any given NPT review cycle, states parties are charged with coming up with consensus recommendations that can then be forwarded on to the review conference, which is the thing that happens every 5 years and is kind of the big review of what has been going on with the treaty. So we are right now, we've had 2 preparatory committee meetings in the current review cycle. We will be heading into the 3rd preparatory committee meeting in spring of 2019. And then in 2020, we'll have the big NPT review conference. So one of the things that's important to note, and one of the kind of reasons why we review the treaty in this particular way, is that in 1995, as I mentioned yesterday, the treaty was either set to expire or needed to be indefinitely extended. And states parties did vote, or did decide without a vote, to indefinitely extend the treaty. So it will never expire. And part of what they decided to do in that process was to kind of revamp the review cycle to make it more possible for there to be a better transfer of institutional memory between the chairs, between the states parties, and to come up with ways to do the review itself more effectively. One thing that has not changed, though, since the time that the NPT was concluded up until this point, is that the goal is really, particularly in the 3rd preparatory committee meeting and the review conference, is to come up with a consensus final document. And so what that means is that states parties, rather than voting on language that they like or coming up with resolutions, typically agree by consensus, or attempt to agree by consensus, on what they can say about the way the treaty has been implemented up until this point, and try to agree on steps that they can take to move forward. You can vote in the NPT, that's allowed under the rules, but that provision is very rarely used, and it's generally considered that agreeing by consensus is the way that things have traditionally been done in the NPT. So another thing that's really important to know about the 1995 conference, it's called the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, is that part of the package that states parties agreed to in indefinitely extending the treaty was a resolution on the Middle East. And it calls upon all of the states in the Middle East to accede to the NPT and to take practical steps towards the establishment of a zone free of all weapons of mass destruction in that region. What the resolution did not do is provide a sort of mechanism or a time frame for implementing this nuclear weapon free zone treaty, or WMD free zone treaty. So it often comes up repeatedly in subsequent NPT review cycles. And we certainly have seen that already in the current review cycle. And I expect that this will be a very big issue in the upcoming review conference in 2020. It's also worth noting as well that even though states are charged with agreeing by consensus to a final document at the review conferences, this doesn't mean that there aren't very deep and kind of long-standing divisions between states parties. So for example, the non-nuclear weapon states are often very dissatisfied with what they perceive as the slow pace of nuclear disarmament. So they are concerned that the nuclear weapon states aren't implementing their obligation to take forward in good faith measures to cease the arms race and move towards nuclear disarmament. And for their part, the nuclear weapon states often say that the security environment is not conducive to continuing nuclear disarmament, but that they are trying to do the best that they can. And they often point to the statistic that we looked at yesterday, which shows that even though there are still many, many, nuclear weapons on the planet, there used to be many more. And so in fact, they have, done a pretty good job of reducing the number of nuclear weapons in fulfillment of their Article 6 obligations. There are a couple of very significant outcomes from NPT review conferences, in addition to the 1995 Review and Extension Conference. One of these came in 2000, when this was the first review conference after the indefinite extension. So it was quite an important one, both practically and symbolically, to show that the treaty and the regime itself are still strong and able to function. And at this review conference, states parties were all able to agree on 13 practical steps regarding non-proliferation and disarmament. So these included things like ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, negotiating a fissile material cutoff treaty, which would reduce the amount of fissile material on the planet over time, irreversible nuclear reductions and further arms control treaties, and measures like that that are very practical steps towards fulfilling what the articles of the NPT kind of lay out in broad terms. 2010 was another NPT review cycle that concluded with what people regard as a kind of very robust, very concrete, and very good outcome final document that states parties were able to agree on by consensus. So in this particular review conference, the states parties negotiated a 64-point action plan of practical steps towards disarmament and further non-proliferation. One of the steps that they agreed to was to convene a 2012 conference on establishing the WMD free zone in the Middle East that I mentioned previously. This still hasn't happened, and interestingly enough, the United States has now kind of stepped back from recognizing this commitment to hold a conference in the Middle East, or with respect to the WMD free zone in the Middle East. And so I think that that will actually become a very significant issue, both in the 2019 preparatory committee meeting and then again at the 2020 review conference. But we can kind of delve into that if you have questions about it. So the last NPT Review Conference that we had was in 2015, and it failed to achieve consensus. That's not that unusual. About half of the NPT Review Conferences do in fact fail to reach consensus, but it makes states parties and the international community nervous because we often equate achieving a consensus final document with an assessment about the health of the non-proliferation regime. So the reasons why, there are several reasons why states parties weren't able to reach consensus. The big one, and the one that is kind of portrayed on the surface as the straw that broke the camel's back, was the failure to be able to agree on next steps to establish the WMD free zone in the Middle East. But I actually think that there were many underlying issues that kind of simmered under the surface that, if the WMD free zone issue had not taken center stage, would probably have erupted. So for example, there were major disagreements between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states about, as I said, the pace of nuclear disarmament. Another really big issue was the rise of the humanitarian impact movement. So that is a movement that recognizes the catastrophic humanitarian impact that would result from the use of nuclear weapons, but also from kind of their development and the way that the nuclear enterprise operates. And many of the non-nuclear weapon states strongly supported including some kind of language in the final document about these catastrophic humanitarian impacts. And this was met with opposition from the nuclear weapon states. So I do believe that had the Middle East not become kind of the focal point issue, that would have been another issue that could have prevented consensus from being reached. But we'll never know, because the Middle East really was the issue over which everything kind of fell apart. Okay, so now I'd like to contemplate a little bit some of the issues that I think will definitely be hot topics of conversation at the upcoming 2020 NPT Review Conference. And some of these, we've had a bit of a preview already, because as I said before, we've already had a preparatory committee meeting in 2017 and in 2018. But as a reminder, these preparatory committee meetings they're not obligated to come up with any kind of consensus language. All that needs to happen under the provisions of the strengthened review process is for the chair of those meetings to write what he or she believes is a factual summary of what the states parties said. So in some ways that kind of relieves some of the pressure on states parties to be able to agree on things. They're allowed to have different, opinions, and nobody needs to capture some language that kind of reflects everybody's opinion and that everybody can agree upon. So I think we're still in for some surprises in 2019 and 2020. I think US-Russia relations are going to be a significant challenge to achieving consensus in 2020. As we discussed previously, and as we talked about yesterday, typically the United States and Soviet Union, and then the United States and Russia, have been able to work very closely on NPT issues. They were founding members of this treaty. They really worked very closely together, despite having serious disagreements on political levels, to conclude this treaty, and then they continued to cooperate very carefully in the years after it was concluded to make sure that the treaty remained robust, to try to encourage other states to join it as non-nuclear weapon states, and to really codify the regime. Lately, however, because of the crisis in US-Russia relations, we've seen a serious inability on, I would say, both the US and Russian side to kind of put some of these higher political issues aside for the sake of working together productively on NPT issues. So at the 2018 NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, for example, we saw a very unusual and sort of unprecedented exchange of rights of reply between the Russian and the American delegations. And these, pertained to a whole host of issues, from potential violations of the Chemical Weapons Convention, to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, to any number of issues on which it would seem like the U.S. and Russia would have an interest in kind of maintaining a uniform perspective and front. So I think that this is an issue that is probably going to dominate the discourse in 2020. It's also going to make it increasingly difficult for the US and Russia to engage in arms control, which is typically something that they would kind of tout and report in fulfillment of their Article 6 obligations. And if you had asked me in 2015 what I thought the big issues are going to be in 2020, this would not have been at the top of my list, but it now is, based on what we've seen already in this review cycle. I also think, the DPRK is going to be a significant issue in 2020. That is such a fast-changing kind of landscape that it's hard for me to predict what things will look like then, so I'm not even going to try. But I do think, the United States has said that the North Korean issue is one of their biggest issues that they're kind of that they think needs to be addressed in the NPT review cycle. And so I think that figuring out what kind of language states parties can try to agree upon with respect to the DPRK, calling upon the DPRK to return to its obligations under the NPT, that sort of thing, will probably take up a lot of time and attention, but could actually be a target of opportunity for states parties to come to some kind of consensus agreement. The WMD free zone in the Middle East, I'm less optimistic that that could serve as a target of opportunity for consensus building. I think with the US change in position with respect to what it sees as its obligations to convene this conference on the establishment of the WMD free zone, I think that is going to be a topic that takes up a lot of time and attention at the review conference, and I don't really see a lot of prospect for agreement on that particular issue. I think even though the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was not part of the establishment of the WMD free zone in the Middle East kind of question, I do think the US withdrawal from that agreement is going to make conversations surrounding the security situation in the Middle East, and therefore the establishment of the WMD free zone, much more complicated. So I see that as something that states parties are going to spend a lot of time trying to kind of navigate and attempt to come up with some consensus language on, but we'll see whether that is even possible. Last on my list here, I have the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I mentioned at the outset that this is a new treaty that was concluded in 2017 that bans nuclear weapons. You've probably heard about it and read about it because the civil society group that was instrumental in kind of advancing that treaty negotiation process was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's an agreement that's gotten a great deal of attention. It kind of emerged from the humanitarian impact movement that I referenced on a previous slide. So not all states parties obviously agree that having a nuclear weapons ban treaty is going to be effective, or that it won't hurt the existing instruments in the non-proliferation regime like the NPT. So I think trying to come up with some kind of consensus language about how we talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and talk about its utility and talk about, welcoming its entry into force will probably be very difficult. When I gave a similar talk last year, I had the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons much higher on my list of issues that I thought would be really, really contentious in 2020. Now I don't really think it's probably I think it's going to be sort of the least of states parties' concerns, to be quite frank with you, because I think that US-Russia relations have taken such a center stage in terms of things that are going to be challenging and problematic in the next couple of years. So, all right, so I do want to talk a little bit about the humanitarian impact movement, just because I think that it's important to kind of understand this new turn in the narrative surrounding opposition to nuclear weapons and arguments for advancing the pace of nuclear disarmament. So the origins of the focus on the humanitarian impact movement can be traced to a 1994 International Court of Justice decision. So in that year, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution asking the ICJ to examine the following question. Is the threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstances permitted under international law? And this question was kind of prompted by a fundamental need to understand the legal framework of the NPT and the legality of nuclear weapons themselves. So states parties wanted to know, is it actually even legal to use a nuclear weapon? And if not, we should ban them. The ICJ concluded that, and this is not, I don't think this is a very satisfactory answer to some states parties, there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. So that's basically kind of reiterating the language of Article 6 under the NPT, but it doesn't say unequivocally yes or no as to whether it is legal to use a nuclear weapon. But nevertheless, this ICJ decision is almost always recalled in NPT final documents and NPT preparatory committee and review conference meetings. And I see it as really kind of setting us down the current path where we now see the international humanitarian law provisions and other legal frameworks being employed as mechanisms to move the nuclear disarmament process farther along. So apropos of this, in the 2010 NPT final document, which you remember was a consensus final document and one that really resulted in some very concrete steps towards nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation. In addition to those things, this document was also the first to recognize deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and to reaffirm the need for all states parties at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. This conclusion and this sort of new element in the discourse around nuclear weapons and disarmament really took on a life of its own after the 2010 NPT Review Conference. And in 2013 and 2014, there were a series of conferences dealing with the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons that kind of took place in 3 different countries over the course of that period. So the third Humanitarian Impact Conference took place in Vienna in 2014, and it was attended by 158 states and culminated in what is called the Humanitarian Pledge, which vowed to kind of fill this legal gap that states parties perceive as being left in the Article 6 provision of the NPT. And 159 states ended up subscribing to this pledge and committing to this particular pledge. So, as I mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons kind of came out of this new turn in the discourse. It was negotiated and concluded in 2017, and it requires 50 ratifications in order for it to enter into force. Just an interesting, piece of trivia, because we're here in Monterey, the ambassador who presided over these negotiations, Elaine White Gomez, is an alumna of our institute. And she very skillfully led 2 rounds of negotiations that concluded in July, and that is when the treaty itself was adopted. So it's kind of interesting to note that none of the nuclear weapon states participated in the negotiation of this treaty. Without getting into the provisions of the treaty itself, I think it does indeed reflect many of the concerns that we've seen voiced by states parties in past NPT review conferences. And it does kind of capture the desire of states parties who are not nuclear weapon states to do something to advance the pace of nuclear disarmament. The nuclear weapon states have primarily come out and said that they do not believe that this treaty is going to have an impact on nuclear disarmament. They don't believe that the non-nuclear weapon states, and they're not incorrect in saying this, can force them to disarm. So they don't think that it's going to be a particularly impactful treaty. But what the proponents of the ban treaty say is that, yes, while that may be correct, that we are not able to, actually physically undertake nuclear disarmament, we have enacted a normative shift by banning nuclear weapons, and we have kind of undermined the what they regard as false logic that holds up the idea of nuclear deterrence, which is used by the nuclear weapon states to argue for why they need to have a nuclear arsenal. And so we'll have to kind of see over time which of these two arguments really turns out to be true. So now I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about nuclear weapon-free zones. There are 7 nuclear weapon-free zones treaties that exist right now, which you can see here on the screen. The first of these was the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which comprises Latin American and Caribbean states. And basically what the nuclear weapon-free zones treaties do is they enable a group of states to conclude regional treaties that ensure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories. The NPT itself does codify the right of states parties to conclude nuclear weapon-free zone treaties if they should want to. So that is something that they're encouraged to do under the NPT, and that's often language that is reiterated in NPT Review Conference final documents. The nuclear weapon-free zone treaties also require states to conclude comprehensive safeguards agreements with the IAEA. So in addition to kind of shoring up a non-nuclear norm in those areas, they also facilitate closer interaction between the IAEA and the states in those regions. You'll see at the very bottom, I've put the WMD free zone in the Middle East, or the question mark, as perhaps a future WMD or nuclear weapon free zone treaty that could be concluded. As I said, we're going to have to see what kind of progress can be made on this issue, but it has been literally decades in the making. So it's, to me, unlikely that there's going to be a significant breakthrough in the current NPT review cycle. Okay, so we've covered a lot of the kind of big nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament treaties, so I want to be sure to touch a little bit upon some of the other treaties and agreements that comprise the regime. So this one is the Biological Weapons Convention, or the BWC. It entered into force in 1975, so not very long after the NPT did, which was entered into force in 1970. It's the first treaty to ban an entire category of weapon. And under this agreement, states parties commit not to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire, number one, microbial or other biological agents or toxins. And then also they agree not to acquire weapons, equipments, or means of delivery designed to kind of use these things for hostile purposes or in an armed conflict. At this time, the BWC has 147 members, and if a violation is suspected, states parties can request a formal investigation through the UN Security Council. There is not a body that oversees the implementation of the BWC, and that is something that some member states and experts in the community have identified as something that's really inhibits the ability of the BWC to be kind of implemented to its fullest possible extent. And I think one of the things that's particularly challenging about enforcing the BWC is the fact that a lot of the equipment and material that would be used in biological weapons production is what we call dual use. So it's stuff that has a military application, but then also a civilian application. So even things as simple as, making yogurt or producing beer or something like that, a lot of the equipment that is used for that fermentation process is also used in making biological weapons. So identifying, what the equipment is, figuring out how to adopt export controls that prohibit the export and import of those types of materials and equipments can be really challenging and often requires kind of industry involvement in order to figure out what exactly where that line is between the civilian and the military. So the Chemical Weapons Convention is another treaty that, again, doesn't deal with nuclear weapons issues, but deals with another very important component of the Nonproliferation Regime. It was concluded, or it entered into force rather, in 1977, and is has many, many, many states parties. 192 states parties have signed on to the Chemical Weapons Convention. It includes the 4 provisions that I've listed here on the slide. And just like the Biological Weapons Convention, and perhaps even to a greater extent, it really has to balance kind of the concerns of industry and the interests of industry with the proliferation challenges that are posed by chemical weapons. One of the things that's unique about the Chemical Weapons Convention is that it includes a provision for challenge inspections, which is something that the BWC does not include. So under the CWC, Article 9 grants states parties to request an on-site challenge inspection to any facility or location located in another state party to the treaty that can be used to clarify and resolve possible compliance issues. It hasn't been used so far by any state party, but it is a resource that states parties have at their disposal if they have questions and concerns about what another state might be doing. There have been some pretty significant accomplishments in the kind of realm of chemical weapons that I think are important to highlight here. The biggest one is really the Syrian chemical weapons issue, although you know, the way that I think recent history has maybe shaped the way that we kind of contextualize this. But in 2013, President Obama said that, you know, based on Syria's use of chemical weapons, he would consider a military strike on that country. But shortly thereafter, Syria sent a letter to the United Nations saying that it would accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention and to start observing its provisions immediately. Then Russia and the United States developed a plan by which they would destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpile on neutral territory. And the way that they did this was by bringing ships offshore to hydrolyze essentially Syria's chemical weapons, and they engaged very closely in cooperation together in order to achieve this objective. For a while, this was kind of upheld as one of the significant ways in which the United States and Russia in modern times could, and post-Soviet times, could work together very closely on not just nuclear non-proliferation issues, but other WMD issues as well. So that is frequently talked about as an accomplishment in that particular context. Oh, I should say as well that unlike the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention is overseen by its own international body that is responsible for kind of making sure that the treaty is being implemented. It's headquartered in The Hague and has a pretty robust staff, over 500 members of the Secretariat. So particularly when you compare that to the Biological Weapons Convention and even the NPT, that is a pretty significant group of experts who are responsible for that particular treaty. Okay, so we talked a little bit yesterday about the CTBT and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was a very long time in the making. Negotiations on this particular, the actual language that would become the CTBT began in 1993, and then the treaty itself opened for signature in 1996. But really, if you look back at the history of US-Soviet relations, you can see that the banning of nuclear testing has always been an objective to which both sides have aspired, because they very clearly recognized that conducting nuclear testing was an important component of developing new nuclear weapons and more nuclear weapons and miniaturized nuclear weapons. And so both sides saw limiting that behavior as something that would be a really important element of the arms control regime. But it's always proven very difficult to negotiate a treaty that comprehensively bans all types of nuclear testing. So not just explosive testing, atmospheric testing, but testing underground as well, because there aren't as many physical manifestations that one can observe of an underground nuclear test. So they had to develop a very important part of concluding the CTBT was figuring out how to actually monitor for compliance. So the CTBT does have a very extensive monitoring regime that's called the International Monitoring System, and it comprises stations that monitor for infrasound, for seismic activity, for hydroacoustic activity, and monitor for radionuclides that could vent as well. So in order for this treaty to enter into force, as I mentioned yesterday, 144 states need to ratify it, but there are 8 states still remaining that have yet to do so. And while Russia has, in fact, ratified the treaty, the United States hasn't. It's signed it, but it was voted down in the Senate in 1999, so that has not yet happened. There was some thinking under the Obama administration that they would put forward the CTBT again for consideration for advice and consent, but that didn't happen, and it is now, based on the language that's in the US Nuclear Posture Review, I think it's quite unlikely that any progress would be made on this particular issue in the next 2 years, but that remains to be seen. Briefly, I want to touch a little bit upon the Conference on Disarmament. So this is the multilateral negotiating forum for disarmament of the international community. It has 65 member states and 38 observer states, and it meets in Geneva from January until September. It operates on consensus, and it has not really been able to agree on a program of work since 1996, which was the year that the negotiation of the CTBT began. You know, it has adopted programs of work periodically, and in fact, it did so again recently, but every session requires it to adopt an agenda. The agenda doesn't just roll over. So even if one session of the CD is in fact able to agree upon an agenda and a program of work, the next session still has to do that again. So that in and of itself is not necessarily a barometer for things, the deadlock improving in the CD. This is really problematic because there are some key issues that the CD is supposed to be considering where no progress has been made because of this kind of deadlock that we've seen over several decades. One of these is a fissile material cutoff treaty or a fissile material treaty, which would halt production of fissile material, which is the material that is used to make nuclear weapons. So this would be very important in kind of reducing over time the number of nuclear weapons that exist in the kind of global arsenal. They're also supposed to be looking at issues to, for example, prevent an arms race in outer space and issues related to negative security assurances. So these are, all important issues that we haven't seen really much progress on at all because the CD has been in a deadlock. The last thing I want to talk about here is export control regimes, because even though these aren't treaties as such, like the ones that we've been talking about before, or negotiating bodies, they do play a really important role in helping states coordinate the ways that they control exports of nuclear material and equipment, and then also things related to chemical and biological production. So again, these are international bodies that states use to kind of organize and coordinate their national export control regimes across different nations. The one you hear about the most frequently, I would say, is the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which was established in 1974, and in fact was, again, an example of close US-Russia and US-Soviet, rather, coordination on this particular issue. And what it does is to harmonize and strengthen nuclear dual-use export control guidelines. So among states that are part of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, it is supposed to make sure that those states are not, do not have weaker export control guidelines than other states that are part of the NSG. And the objective is to make sure that there are appropriate safeguards in place when dual-use material is exported. Both India and Pakistan right now are seeking membership to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, so that might be something that you kind of hear about in the news, but I would also be happy to talk a little bit more about the history of the establishment of that group as well, if that is something that is of interest. So I think with that, I'm happy to take any questions, Masako, things that you might have. Just to kind of sum up though, in general, you know, the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes are made up of both treaties and organizations and different fora, and then physical places that have hallways and bathrooms like the United Nations. The cornerstone of that regime remains the NPT. It's been that way for 5 decades, but there are many components of it that work in concert. And then there are new elements that are being added as well, like the ban treaty. So, you know, we talked yesterday about Kennedy's concerns that there would be more than 20, you know, nuclear weapon states by the end of 1964. And obviously we see today that that hasn't happened. And I think we can conclude that even though the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes have issues and face particular challenges, overall they've done a pretty good job. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really comprehensive lecture, and you went through all the non-proliferation regimes. So thank you so much.
Sure.
So I just wanted to have some conversation or some question for those who are watching videos, and I also had some questions. So let's start with the NPT, the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regimes. So you clearly explained that any nuclear non-proliferation treaty has three pillars, non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful use. So obviously, each country has a different, interest. In your view, are these 3 pillars treated equally under the NPT, or what's your view on the different perspectives toward these 3 pillars? Because nuclear weapon states often say this is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. This is not a nuclear disarmament treaty. So if you could share your view, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a great question, and you're really getting at one of the kind of core challenges of the NPT, which is that states have different priorities. And I think those priorities have actually evolved over time. So when the treaty itself was negotiated, the big concern was that states that did not possess nuclear weapons would get them. And that was the fear that kind of motivated the negotiation of that treaty. I would say Article 6, if you look back at the negotiating history, was kind of thrown in as an article that would appease the non-nuclear weapon states and would encourage them to join the treaty. It was kind of a carrot, but I don't think it was necessarily, if you look at the actual language of it, it doesn't really commit the nuclear weapon states to do much besides undertake good faith efforts, which are not defined in the treaty itself, towards ceasing the nuclear arms race. But the non-proliferation component really is, quite concrete and very robust, and has these IAEA safeguards that are an important part of it. I think the non-nuclear weapon states have done a very good job of implementing their non-proliferation commitments under the treaty. And I think that that has shifted the attention to the disarmament pillar of the treaty. So even though it is a non-proliferation treaty, because the vast majority of states parties to the NPT are non-nuclear weapon states, and they feel that they have done a good job of implementing their obligations, I think the focus is shifting a lot more towards the disarmament pillar. And I think the nuclear weapon states are kind of in a more defensive position where they need to be able to say, well, yes, we are implementing our obligations, and these are the ways in which we are doing it. One of the challenges, though, is that numbers don't necessarily matter in the NPT context, because the mandate is to agree by consensus. So if the nuclear weapon states don't agree with the way that the non-nuclear weapon states are characterizing their fulfillment of their Article 6 obligations, they can say we're not going to agree with that language. And so they kind of have veto power to make sure that the way that progress towards disarmament is being characterized meets with their national interests and their expectations. So there's always this tension between non-proliferation and disarmament issues. I actually think that since we've been talking about nuclear risk reduction, this is an area that I see as falling across both the non-proliferation and disarmament pillars, and could therefore be a way to kind of make them truly mutually reinforcing. But you're right that there is always this tension. And then you notice that I haven't even brought up peaceful uses. That is because even though there are three main committees at the review conferences, one of which is indeed dedicated to reviewing the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, it's often kind of characterized as almost being the redheaded stepchild of the NPT, because it's not a place where states parties have put a lot of attention. But I do think in this very, very contentious review cycle that we're in right now, that it might be worth states parties paying a bit more attention to peaceful uses, because I do see that as an area where the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states share a strategic interest.
Okay, thank you so much for explanation. So it is obvious there are lots of tensions between nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The other, additionally, I also see the other tension that we often see is non-nuclear weapon states are arguing non-use of nuclear weapons, especially no first use. So my understanding is in the NPT, there is no commitment of non-use or no first use. Could you also touch upon that aspect? Because we often hear the non-nuclear weapon states are talking about this no first use. So.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think China is the only one of the nuclear weapon states that has an official no first use policy, meaning that it only wants to maintain a second strike capability. It is not ever going to be the first to initiate a nuclear exchange. I believe that the Soviet Union did actually have a no first use policy, but then it moved away from that. So that has not been in place for a long time. And then periodically you will hear calls within US government to consider adopting a no first use policy. And that was something that I heard a lot about under the Obama administration, but again, we've moved away from that currently. You know, the other call that I've heard very frequently in the past probably 18 months has been for the United States and Russia to reaffirm the maxim that Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to, which is that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And that is not a no first use policy, but it is capturing the idea that you really can't initiate a nuclear exchange because it's just going to precipitate a nuclear war, which can never be won and therefore must never be fought. So I think that if, for example, the United States and Russia were able to issue a joint statement where they reaffirmed their commitment to that particular maxim, that even though that would not be the adoption of an official no first use policy, it might represent kind of the best thing that we could hope for under the current security situation and with the current high political situation.
Thank you. So speaking of the commitment from the nuclear weapon states not to use nuclear weapons against NPT non-nuclear weapon state, you also talked about nuclear weapons free zones. Mm-hmm. So my understanding is that countries in the nuclear weapon states are guaranteed not to be attacked by nuclear weapon. However, there is some uncertainty on this issue. So, but I think a nuclear weapon free zone issues are very important to understand no first use or no use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon state. So if you could elaborate that point, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So, there are kind of two issues here. One is negative security assurances, irrespective of nuclear weapon-free zones, but just negative security assurances. And then the other is that there are protocols that are part of nuclear weapon-free zone treaties that the nuclear weapon states are supposed to sign and ratify. So in just across the board, in the NPT context, you will often hear calls from the non-nuclear weapon states for the nuclear weapon states to issue negative security assurances, which mean that they are not going to attack the non-nuclear weapon states. And that has always been kind of an issue of contention in the NPT context, and the non-nuclear weapon states are typically pushing for stronger language in final documents that reflects these negative security assurances. And the nuclear weapon states are pushing back against that and kind of looking for more flexible language with respect to NSAs. Then as far as the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties go, yeah, it's true that there are these protocols that the nuclear weapon states are supposed to sign and ratify that say, indeed, we will not use nuclear weapons against the states that have concluded this zone treaty. And the United States has not ratified a number of these. They have to go through the Senate for ratification, just like any other treaty agreement. And you almost always hear calls in the NPT context from the states who are members of these zones for all of the nuclear weapon states to sign and ratify the associated protocols. But, again, because thinking particularly of the US domestic political situation, because of the difficulties faced in trying to get any treaty, through the Senate, I don't see a lot of movement on that in the next couple of years, but it is something that I think would represent a pretty important contribution to shoring up the zone treaties and the non-proliferation regime more broadly.
Okay, thank you. So you said China is the only NPT nuclear weapon state that have officially committed to the no first use. So, and as we discussed yesterday, also the United States seems to be lowering the threshold of the nuclear use. Of course, no one wants to see nuclear weapons will be used again, but given this current political climate in the United States, do you think non-nuclear weapon states' frustration toward these nuclear weapons policy are increasing?
Well, yes, I certainly do think so. And if they are not increasing, I don't know why that is. I think a lot of the non-nuclear weapon states who are not, allies of the nuclear weapon states and don't fall under their nuclear umbrellas are very concerned about what they perceive as a lowering of the threshold of the use or deployment of nuclear weapons, of an increased emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons in nuclear postures, all that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that is absolutely a source of concern. And I think that even though, nuclear disarmament is not the same thing as changing your nuclear posture so that there is a decreased emphasis on nuclear weapons, those are, two different issues. They are really interlinked. And so as you see greater reliance on nuclear weapons in nuclear postures, that makes it all the much more difficult to do away with nuclear weapons in the long run because they play such an important role in security and defense postures.
Oh, yeah, so thank you. So do you think it is fair to say that current especially the United States nuclear weapons policy, especially as described in the nuclear posture review, do you think this is increasing the nuclear risk on the whole, basically globally?
Yeah, well, I do. I think that I mean, one of the things that I think is particularly concerning about the US Nuclear Posture Review is that there is a reference in it to what is believed to be a Russian policy of escalate to de-escalate. And so that is the idea that by using nuclear weapons in a very limited way to diffuse a conflict, you could prevent the escalation of a full-blown nuclear war. Now, obviously, that sounds like a pretty crazy idea, and many, many Russian experts have come out and said, this is not, in fact, a part of our nuclear posture. This is not codified in our actual nuclear posture. But the fact that the United States nuclear doctrine is making reference to it and acting as though it is a fact, I find particularly concerning. And I do think that that is the type of miscommunication that we were kind of talking about yesterday that could precipitate the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. Because if regardless of what Russian policy actually is, if US policymakers believe that the Russian Federation might use nuclear weapons in a limited fashion to diffuse a kinetic conflict, that is going to increase the likelihood that Americans would use nuclear weapons in exactly that same way. So yeah, I do think that, that is something that I think is particularly concerning about the current US posture. I also think, by the same token, that in development of different types of nuclear weapons, of lower yield nuclear weapons, of things that could encourage a national government like the United States to use nuclear weapons more readily because they're not strategic weapons, they're tactical weapons. Obviously, yeah, that lowers the threshold to nuclear use as well.
Okay, thank you. So now we see lots of challenges toward the 2020 NPT review cycle. And again, you emphasizes the most difficult challenge is the US deteriorating US-Russia relations. And I also agree. And so like you said, I also previously, I thought the division between between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states of the disarmament policy, particularly the ban treaty, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, is going to be the biggest, one of the biggest challenges. But apparently now we have more difficulties among the nuclear weapon states, especially US and Russian relations. So I do agree. So, but still, going back to this ban treaty, the product of the frustration among the non-nuclear weapon states toward the lack of progress in the nuclear disarmament. So what do you think, what's your prospect on the division between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states and the disarmament policy, and what kind of a negative impact we may see toward the 2020 NPT Review Conference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it's not like the ban treaty is just going to go away as an issue. And even if the ban treaty goes away as an issue, the emphasis on the humanitarian impact and the humanitarian impact movement, still have momentum and still exist. So yeah, in no way do I want to say that I think that that is an issue that has, gone by the wayside. I just think it's going to be eclipsed by these bigger issues because that is what we saw in 2018. I think the big challenge in 2019 and 2020, where there is a mandate for states parties to come up with some consensus language, will be how we talk about the ban treaty. I mean, how do we characterize it? So it can, if you haven't read final documents, it can be a little hard to imagine what I mean. But for example, there will be a reference to the ban treaty in the 2020 NPT final document, if there is one, for sure, because it's something that happened and it is now a part of the non-proliferation and disarmament mechanisms and regime, whether you like that or not. But states parties are going to need to figure out, if they want to agree on a consensus final document, how do we characterize it? Do we say that we welcome the entry into force of that treaty if it has entered into force? Do we say we note that this treaty has been concluded and kind of leave it at that? I don't think that's going to be satisfying to the states parties of that treaty or to the states that participated in the negotiations or who voted for it. So I think that is going to be something that is really, really difficult. And I haven't seen a lot of progress towards thinking about what that type of consensus language might look like. It is interesting to kind of observe the way that states parties have talked about the ban treaty already in the NPT review cycle, though. So you see the ban treaty supporters really driving home the ways in which they see the ban treaty as being complementary to and compatible with the NPT. And then you see the opponents on the nuclear weapon state sides saying, no, the ban treaty is actually diminishing support for the NPT and is positioning itself as kind of a rival treaty rather than as something that's complementary. So those issues absolutely still exist, and they are just kind of capturing, I think, some of the bigger fault lines that we see between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. But I wonder if we'll even have time to kind of discuss those issues in depth at the 2020 review conference with all of the other things that have kind of cropped up unexpectedly so far in the review cycle.
Thank you. That's another really big challenge we have to keep our eye on it. So I'm also glad that you mentioned the humanitarian impact. Some people are now putting too much emphasis on the ban treaty. Of course, that's also important. So I'm glad that you had a separate session for the humanitarian impact, because sometimes I have heard that some people argue that the humanitarian impact, like humanitarian approach, did not need to lead to the ban treaty. Some people say that. Mm-hmm. What's your view on that argument?
Yeah, it's an interesting argument, and you can see that pretty clearly when you look at, for example, the states that pledged the humanitarian pledge versus then subsequently those states that voted for the ban treaty itself. And they're not always the same states. I mean, there's a core group that is similar, that is the same between those two bodies of states. But then there are also states who committed to the humanitarian pledge, but then did not vote in favor of the ban treaty. So I kind of look at it as, you have the humanitarian impact movement, and then you have the ban treaty as one possible culmination of that movement, but it's certainly not the only path that could have taken. And I actually see the issue of nuclear risk reduction as being something that is also very closely linked to the humanitarian impact movement, or at least could be, because there would be significant humanitarian impact if a nuclear weapon were to be used, right? So nuclear risk reduction is another kind of channel where the energy from the humanitarian impact movement, I think, could be channeled. So I don't think that the ban treaty should be, regardless of how you feel about the ban treaty, I don't think it should be perceived as the end of the road for the momentum behind the humanitarian impact movement. I think that movement should, and proponents of that movement should be thinking about different manifestations of that, that energy and that philosophy and that discourse, and that nuclear risk reduction could be a really logical next kind of direction that they could go in.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been also thinking about that issue quite often, because we sometimes hear that, especially from the ban treaty opponent, saying that nuclear weapons ban treaty ignore the nuclear risk reduction. Mm-hmm. So, but for the ban treaty proponent, the total elimination, the complete ban of nuclear weapons use, and the complete elimination of nuclear weapons is the ultimate nuclear risk reduction, elimination of a risk. I also tend to agree to that argument. So I always see these two parallel argument, which doesn't see the some common ground. So that's also generating some new crisis because of this lack of communication, lack of dialogue between ban treaty opponents and the ban treaty proponent. So what's your view on bringing completely two different parties to discuss this issue? I know it's a very million-dollar question.
Tough question. Yeah. No, that's a really big issue. And, I think language is something that's really important in the NPT context, because that's basically the end game, is you're trying to figure out how can you agree to characterize certain events and certain things that you're going to do in the future. And so I think that there are actually a number of areas where the nuclear weapon states and the ban treaty proponents, for example, could find ways to converge their views. And as I said previously, I do think that nuclear risk reduction is one of these areas. I also think, we used to talk a lot about a building block approach in the NPT context. So kind of building different blocks that you can stack together that are components of the regime that will lead to the ultimate fulfillment of Article 6 and disarmament. So why the ban treaty cannot be, one of these building blocks is something that I don't fully understand or subscribe to, but I think it has something to do with the fact that the ban treaty itself has become sort of an anathema for the nuclear weapon states, and it's the way that we talk about the ban treaty is something that they simply cannot agree to. So that's kind of why I think if we're going to come up with any sort of consensus language in 2020, we should be thinking now collaboratively with the diversity of states about, how are we going to talk about the ban treaty in a way that is, acceptable to everybody, if there is a way to do that, because that's not a conversation that you can flesh out in 4 weeks in New York. You need to be thinking about that in advance. But it's a really tough question. I don't have an answer for what language you could actually use to talk about that.
Thank you. I don't have an answer either, but as you said, if we focus on more nuclear risk, and also, I believe, re-emphasize the humanitarian initiative, that because, as you said, nuclear risk and humanitarian impact is absolutely tightly connected. So I also saw that some countries who opposed to the ban treaty resolution that was adopted most recent UN General Assembly First Committee. But those countries, some of those countries supported the humanitarian initiative. So I see humanitarian initiative could bring more supporters. Of course, having said that, I personally support the ban treaty. And of course, I do understand there are lots of different opinions. So I really think it's very important to find some common ground where both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, meaning ban treaty opponents and then ban treaty proponents, can talk at the same place.
I agree.
I really feel this lack of a conversation, lack of a communication is really increasing the risk significantly. So you also, perhaps this may be my final question, but you talked about conference on disarmament, which is also important organization, but as you said, since 1996, the CD, Conference on Disarmament, has failed to agree on a program of work. So almost, it's too long.
Yeah, it's more than 2 decades.
Too long. Yeah. 2 decades, exactly, 2 decades. but they are supposed to negotiate a very, very important disarmament non-proliferation treaty, such as the fissile material cutoff treaty. So in your view, this stalemate, the deadlock at Conference on Disarmament, is this also increasing the nuclear risk? Why the diplomats are not really focusing on the more like a productive outcome? Why they could just stay in the stalemate for over 20 years?
Yeah, well, talk about a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, I can't imagine. I think it's an incredibly important negotiating body. It's the body that negotiated the CTBT. It's, back in the day, in a previous iteration, it actually was considering, it negotiated the Chemical Weapons Convention. In a previous iteration, it negotiated, there's actually a draft radiological weapons convention that the US and Soviet Union put forward. I mean, it had all these really important treaties that it was responsible for considering and negotiating. And since the NPT, that's not the forum where that's going to happen. I mean, that's not a negotiating body in that same way. So the CD is really the place where that is supposed to happen. And the other thing that's really important about the CD is that it comprises in its membership nuclear weapon possessing states that are not part of the NPT. And so it's one of the only kind of fora where you're going to have a conversation about nuclear weapons issues with states who are not party to the NPT, but who definitely have an interest in being part of those conversations. I do think there's something to be said for kind of the normative impact that the stalemate has had. I think that a lot of states parties and particularly, even policymakers and members of the expert community have kind of given up hope on the CD because they feel like the stalemate is so intractable that there's kind of no way to move past that. And so they discount it as, a useful place where you can do treaty making and policy making. And they're not totally wrong. I mean, the CD is embroiled in the stalemate, and we see little glimmers of hope from time to time that seem to suggest that the stalemate is breaking up, but nothing really concrete yet. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have any real suggestions for ways to break the stalemate. There's often conversations about, changing the way that the program of work is agreed upon so that it makes it a little bit easier to come to some kind of conclusion about what they're even going to be considering or what they're supposed to be doing. But I haven't seen any indication that that's happening yet. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we learned a lot, and the bottom line is there are lots of challenges in the international non-proliferation and disarmament regimes, but definitely there are some hopes. Mm-hmm. So I would like to conclude this session, but Sarah, do you have any final word to give us some silver lining if you have?
Yeah, the silver lining, I mean, I do think we've been sort of talking ad nauseum about risk reduction, but I do think that that is an area where I have heard and seen increasing interest over the past, particularly the past 6 months, but even really the past year, I would say. It's not going to be entirely satisfying for states that really want to see progress on nuclear disarmament, but I do actually think it's sort of the best target of opportunity for states parties to be able to agree on something concrete. And so even though, the reason we're talking about risk reduction is because we're in a very perilous situation where the US-Russia relationship is in such bad straits that we're really thinking about what would we do, if there was a nuclear exchange and how do we head that off at the pass. I do think in a kind of sad way that has provided a target of opportunity for an area where states with very different interests can at least agree on the need to reduce nuclear risk.
Great, thank you. So with that note, we would like to conclude this section. So thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you very much, Sarah, for your excellent lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.